Hi, I'm Lauren Myers, Associate Editor of Monograph Matters. I'm talking today to Laura Wray-Lake and Laura Abrams, two authors of a recent monograph of the Society for Research in Child Development. The work is titled Pathways to Civic Engagement Among Urban Youth of Color. You can visit monographmatters.srcd.org for videos, commentaries, teaching materials, and additional content related to this work. So, Laura Wray-Lake, can you start by explaining what you mean by civic engagement and specifically how this term is used in developmental science versus in the field of social welfare?
Civic engagement, most people now are thinking of it in a multidimensional way. So what we mean by it is a range of different behaviors, attitudes, skills, knowledge that relate to commitments and contributions to your community or to your larger society. So things like volunteering, things like political action, those have been the main things that were studied over a few decades in developmental research for young people. But now, as more research is coming out, there's a lot more dimensions that we're understanding. There's critical consciousness. There's attitudes that we know are important. Empowerment or agency is important. So all of those things fall under this larger umbrella of civic engagement. And especially when we're thinking about civic engagement from a developmental perspective, it's really important to have this multidimensional view because young people have different opportunities for engagement. So you can't just use one metric to understand all of young people's engagement. And also they have different interests and different outlets. And so a multidimensional definition really tries to recognize all the many different ways that young people are committed to their community and their larger society.
When you ask about social welfare and developmental science, in general, social welfare takes an applied approach to scholarship in the sense that we want the scholarship to be directly applicable to interventions, policies, or direct practices that can improve the lives of vulnerable populations. So when you talk about civic engagement from a social welfare perspective, we're looking at things like giving voice to marginalized communities, how people come together to form more social cohesion, maybe to fight powers that are oppressive in their communities. Mm-hmm. So not just as a developmental milestone, but as a tool toward action and betterment of community.
Great. That's really interesting, the kind of the distinction between the basic science of it and the applied, specifically the social justice application of your work. Turning back to Laura Wray-Lake, can you tell us about some of the overarching goals of your project? What were you trying to do and what were your aims?
For me, I've been studying young people's civic engagement for a long time, mostly adolescents, but also young adults. And I've mostly, before this, taken a quantitative perspective where we do survey research. We ask young people about all the different aspects of civic engagement and then measure that over time, often in longitudinal studies. But what I came to realize is that most of our knowledge, really the bulk of it, came from mostly white, mostly middle-class samples of adolescents. And so we really don't have a fleshed out enough view of what civic engagement means in other types of contexts. And youth of color, there is a really exciting body of literature already there on youth of color and the ways that they participate in activism. There's a lot of great qualitative work and some quantitative work on that. But overall, relatively speaking, there's a lot less that we know about youth of color and how they're civically engaged. And one of the biggest questions for me was maybe civic engagement doesn't mean the same thing or look the same ways for youth of color that it does for these more white middle class young people. And so the definitions and the measures that we use for civic engagement may not be really give the full picture of how youth of color are civically engaged in their communities. So that was really one of the big questions that I came to the research with. And then the other question was wanting to understand their civic engagement in context, which often as developmental scientists, we're interested in, behavior in context. And so wanting to know about what are the assets that young people have and draw from in their communities, and what are some adversities that they may experience, and how do these things work together to shape their civic engagement.
Research tends to, or has historically tended to, really pathologize youth in urban contexts, especially all the focus on the risks and at-risk behavior. And, even though that research started out in an attempt to try to locate areas of intervention, it ended up kind of classifying a whole generation of youth, or in poverty, or in poor youth of color, poverty, all kinds of youth, as being more at risk than having strengths. And so we think that civic engagement is one way to look at where there are, pockets of strengths. Also kind of flipping the script in a way, to say, okay, youth do face adversity, but they also face it in a way where they're actively resisting. They're actively inserting their voice into conversations that are usually reserved for adults, and they're doing it in a way to try to make a difference in their neighborhood and in their communities.
I think one of the things that's unique about the work that we did was that when we went to young people, we really wanted to hear what they thought civic engagement looked like and meant to them, how they engaged, and what were some of the factors that helped them engage. So at every step of the conversations we had with them, they really set the terms. They really defined civic engagement. They defined what their community was and what it meant to them, and sort of what assets and adversities they face. So really all of our findings draw from their perspectives, and just highlighting how they see civic engagement and how they see their context for civic engagement.
Related to that, can you tell us how you got the youth to open up during these interviews, or how you established a rapport during that interview process? Because it seems like that trust in the interviewer and the relationship with the interviewer would be really important to, as you say, hear their voice.
We recruited young people through recreation centers in Rochester. I was a professor, assistant professor at University of Rochester at the time, so that's the connection to Rochester. And at these centers, there are staff people who really spend huge amounts of time with the young people, hours and hours a day during the school year, over the summer, so they know them so well. And when I went to talk to them about the study, I went to 5 different centers, and these staff people really resonated with the idea of taking a positive youth development perspective, as opposed to focusing on deficits, which is what Laura was mentioning earlier. And so they were very excited about this study, and they really helped us recruit young people for this study. And really in that process, that was sort of part of the rapport building process, because these young people trust the staff people so much, they look up to them. And so when the staff are saying this is something interesting, they really listened and respected that. And so when we first met them, we already had a little bit of trust established based on our established relationships and the time we had spent in the centers, with the staff people. And then in the actual interview process, it is sometimes challenging to interview adolescents in particular, there's a power dynamic. I'm older, they're younger, and I think it's all about, starting out with things that are easy to talk about, building up to more complex things, really putting out there that they're the experts on their own experience. We're just there to learn from them. That really helps a lot. Asking them to tell stories about their experiences are things that really help them be able to share. And really just that there's no wrong answers. We're just there to learn from them, and I think many of them really did open up in ways where the conversations were really rich, and we learned so much from them.
To the extent that your background and your personal experiences might have been different than those of your interviewees, can you speak a little bit to how those differences informed your research or how you dealt with them during the process of interviewing?
We were a team of mostly white researchers going into communities that were mostly youth and people of color. And so there was that difference at the outset. We knew that going in. We really value elevating the voices and experiences of youth of color, and that was one of the main goals of the project. And we tried to be sensitive to the fact that there was the difference there that might prevent them from opening up or, somehow compromise our ability to do the research well. And so we did a lot that we describe in the monograph. We took many steps to try to do trainings on cultural humility. We tried to establish the rapport like I talked about. We actually said at the beginning of the interview that we recognize the difference between us, that, we're white, they're not white, and that might create some challenges or reluctance to open up. So we tried to name that, and sometimes naming those things can really relieve the young people and help them talk about issues related to race or discrimination and things like that. And so we found that to be helpful. But also we do recognize that white researchers might not have the full perspective. We might be limited in some ways in the way that we could talk with the young people. So we don't see ourselves as authorities on youth of color. But we hope that still by elevating these young people's voices that we're able to contribute to this body of scholarship.
It sounds like the relationships are so important here that that your youth interviewees have a relationship with the managers of the youth centers, and that you're establishing those relationships, and that is why the youth trust you, and that in that relationship, I'm hearing a lot of genuineness and honesty of putting important and difficult issues on the table so that the youth then feel comfortable talking about them. Would you agree with that?
I think that's exactly right.
Thank you for talking with us, Laura Wray-Lake and Laura Abrams. To learn more, please read the full monograph entitled Pathways to Civic Engagement Among Urban Youth of Color. This monograph is issue 85.2 of the Monographs for the Society for Research and Child Development. For videos, commentaries, teaching materials, and more resources about this work, you can visit monographmatters.srcv.org. Thank you.